And hi, everybody. This is a talk I prepared called The Future of Change Management. It's something I've been thinking about as a project, I would say almost for a decade, and it's resulted in, a bunch of books and all that kind of stuff. So I'm excited to share, but I also want to make this interactive. So there'll be times when I'll be putting a spotlight back on you to think through some things together. I have this mantra I say sometimes that people learn best when they're talking and not when they're listening. I don't know if that's true, but it's something I'm known for saying. And there's also an invitation to just grab me on LinkedIn, by the way, if you want to just click on connect and something like that. So we're connected for the rest of our lives. So welcome. My consulting career has had three epiphanies in it. The first epiphany was called the report in a drawer epiphany when I was a strategy consultant 30 years ago at PwC in London. And we used to prepare lovingly, working all hours till midnight, as you do when you're a young 30-year-old consultant, one of the cannon fodder, and these long reports on strategy, on risk management. And what was incredibly disappointing to me at the time was that clients used to love the work, used to pay the fees, and very little of what we recommended actually became material business change. And that was extraordinarily disappointing to me. And I used to wonder when I was a young consultant, I was idealistic. I thought we were going to change the world. I thought our ideas would make sense, add value to our clients' businesses. And they loved our ideas, but there was a gap between them liking what we said and agreeing with it and actually being able to take action. And that prompted for me a huge career change to move from being a strategy consultant to a change consultant. I always refer to it as going over to the dark side. And so I went over to the dark side and I ran into another epiphany, and this one's much more recent, is the knowing doing gap. I've become an expert in change management through doing a master's, doing 3 or 4 certificates in coaching, all the change management stuff you do earlier in your career to become competent. And a lot of the techniques we were using to change behavior in organizations were influencing techniques. So they were training, town halls, workshops, communications of various forms. All of these are based on the premise that if you change what's inside someone's head, their ideas, their mindsets, their beliefs, their motivations, their values, that the behavior will naturally follow. And again, it was one of these epiphanies that started with a great big disappointment. In fact, it's not the case. I remember reading early in my career that only 10% of management training transfers to the job. This is a research study from 1981 that people always cite. Only 10% of management training transfers to the job. And again, it was a moment for me. It's like, when are people going to blow the whistle on us? A bit like our strategy recommendations back in the early 1990s, is we're charging big fees here and we're not producing the value that I think we ought to be producing. In this case, I'm talking about the value of behavioral change. So those are 2 of my epiphanies. And now I'm going to hand it over to you before I talk about the third one of those. Just fire away in the chat how organizations have changed since 2000, let's say. What are the ways in which things are now different? Just blast away. Have you got a time machine from 2000 and you woke up in the IBM of 2023? Whoa. Ways of working, we got one answer there. Change is more rapid. I would say remote working, digitization, re-engineering processes. And we can come up with Gen Z, millennial differences, diversity and inclusion is a much bigger thing. Sustainability is also a much bigger thing. So between us on this call, we can come up with 30 or 40 or 50 things where the business world is somewhat, it's the same, but it's unrecognizable. There are things we do today that would have been considered impossible in 2000. And then the second question is, what have been the breakthroughs in your world as talent experts in the human sciences. In other words, what has psychology and sociology and anthropology and neuroscience, how have those changed the way we think about human beings and why human beings do what they do inside organizations? What are our learnings in psychology? I'll give you a few hints. There's been a huge growth in neuroscience, for example. That's one that you wouldn't have been talking about in 2000, right? You wouldn't have been talking about amygdalas, and you wouldn't be talking about SCARF and some of these ideas from neuroscience. AI is one for sure. There's another one called psychological safety. Yeah, autonomy is a very important change to worker mindset. The importance of it, the importance of purpose is something that wouldn't have been talked about in the in the 2000s, early 2000s. We wouldn't talk about the purpose of an organization or finding purpose at work, or you wouldn't talk about it very much. Now it's talked about all the times. So these are great. And so with that as a backdrop, we've had these really crazy changes in the world of work. And we've had these really, I think, transformational changes in the human sciences. Question is change management kept up? And if you look here at the change management models, which are the right side of this slide here, you'll have all the usual suspects. You'll have ADKAR, and you'll have ProSci, and you'll have Cotter, and you'll have Connor, and you'll have various Levine, various other models. Most of those models were birthed in the 1980s, which is why I have a picture from one of my favorite television shows. Is just like an 80s hairstyle is not going to cut it today when you're out in the real world. We have to ask ourselves the question about whether the change management models designed in the late 20th century are fit for purpose, are sufficiently robust to affect change in 2023. And so that's the question, that's my provocation to you, is with all the change in the world, all this stuff on the right, which you probably heard of in your MBA, or maybe you're an experienced change practitioner, you use some of these things, are they still relevant? And that's the question. I'm going to hand over another poll here. There are 3 questions that are part of it. This is going to be done sort of rather informally. But let's take the first one, part of the poll. People have preferred ways of taking in information. Just give me a sort of a true or false in the chat. Yeah. My kids don't read, right? They're like, they get the information from YouTube. Yeah, it's largely true. Okay, here's another question that follows along from that. People learn faster and better if you adapt the way you're teaching them to their preferences. So in other words, little Johnny prefers reading, and someone else is visual, someone else is auditory, someone else is kinesthetic. Your inclination is that that's true. And then the third poll question is that, and this is a kind of an ethical question, is teachers should adapt the way they teach to learner preferences. So if someone says they prefer visual learning or auditory learning or kinesthetic learning or one of the other learning styles dimensions, teachers should pay attention to that, and they should adapt their learning content. And I am going to argue that 1 is true, but it's only trivially true. 2 is false, and 3 is very problematic. So this was a bit of an epiphany for me when I was writing a book called The Science of Organizational Change in 2013. I was also doing a lot of reading in a book called The 50 Myths of Popular Psychology. You might want to make a note of that, The 50 Myths of Popular Psychology. And this is the third epiphany that I want to discuss, because I had been trained in change management in the 1990s. And we talked ceaselessly about learning styles. And when we were designing training, we would think about, well, what about the visual learners? What about the auditory learners and the kinesthetic learners? We took that into account, not just in our training courses, but also in our communications for organizations. When we were doing communications planning, communication strategy for clients, we would think about people's learning styles, how they like to take in information. This was at the core, one of the first things I was taught as a change management consultant in call it 1995. When I read 50 Myths of Popular Psychology, this is the third epiphany, there was one chapter on learning styles, which said, it's all a bunch of rubbish. And I was horrified because my identity was, I'm an expert in this stuff, right? I have a global reputation as sort of someone who's known for being good at change management, knowing what's up. And this is something that was at the core of what was informing my practice, a mental model, if you will, that was false. So why is it false? Okay, so it's trivially true that we have preferences, right? I read newspapers, and I actually even like physical newspapers from time to time, right? Some people don't these days, right? I prefer to take in information in text. It's trivially true that we have preferences. That's really, really not a big deal. Now, the question is whether you learn faster if the material is presented in accord with your preference. And that's an interesting question. And you would think, yes, right? It's intuitive. Like, I like visual learning. If you present content to me visually, I will learn faster. That's like an intuitive hypothesis. The fact is, unfortunately, when academics study this stuff, and this stuff is fairly easy to study, you present people material in accord with their learning style preference, and you expect them to learn faster, and they don't. You can measure retention. You can measure how quickly people learn things. And it's absolutely false that matching the content of learning to someone's learning style learns faster and better. And this was a shocking thing for me. Like, it was one of these things like, wow, I've been doing this my whole life for the last 25 years, and it's patently false. And there are a lot of different ways to test it. There's a whole chapter in one of my books on learning styles and the way we want to think about things. But here's another question, and this is the more troubling question of the learning styles world. And the question is, are you serving the learner? And one of the guys who wrote that book, 50 Myths of Popular Psychology, is named Scott Lilienfeld, passed away very sadly and tragically last year. Scott Lilienfeld posed this question to me in a podcast. He said, say I have a young soccer player. And he's a very talented young soccer player, and he's right-hand dominant, right foot dominant, right? And his strong preference, if he gets the ball, he gets it onto his right foot before he kicks it, right? That's normal enough for the young soccer player. Are you serving him by drilling his right foot? Or in order to make him a competent, potentially superstar soccer player one day, do you have to drill the foot that he's uncomfortable with, his left foot? And when he said that to me, the scales kind of fell from my eyes, because I thought that it was a good idea to present people content in accordance with their preferences. Well, he was saying this can actually be harmful. And there's a notion in the world that this is part of, which is that learning needs to be comfortable. And even though that, a questionable assumption, if we take our soccer player example, and in order to make them a well-rounded performer, they need to be able to use their left foot. And in the case of a learner in today's corporate world, we're at IBM, we need to be able to learn, we need to be multimodal learners. Some people say human learning is one of the great superpowers for the next several decades. I don't know if it ever wasn't. So that's one of the things that Guru says, this like, okay, yeah, what's new? But however, we need to learn multimodally. Like the young soccer player, we need to learn who needs to learn to kick with his left foot. We need to learn, my kids need to learn to read text, because there's information that's best received in text. And the other thing about adapting content, the way you present learning information to learners, is sometimes the content should determine the way you present the information. So for example, it's all very well watching YouTube videos on skating, if that's your preferred learning style. But you actually have to, if you're going to progress as a skater, you have to lace up the skates and get on the rink. And so this idea that learning should be comfortable and that we should cosset people and we should present them information in the way that they're most comfortable with is, I think, a false and dangerous idea. And it was a shock to my system when I read it. And I began to wonder to myself, how much else of what I was taught about change management in the 1990s is rubbish? That's an interesting question. So the other thing that gets a full chapter in the book is MBTI. How many people know their MBTI preference? I'll put mine in the chat. I'm an ENTP. How about that? I don't think there's a person alive that hasn't done the MBTI. So the question is with MBTI is it useful, right? Is it valid? Like scientifically, is it a valid way of assessing personality? And secondly, okay, even if it's not like super duper valid, but maybe it's useful, right? So maybe even though it's not going to pass some kind of ivory tower test of reliability and validity from industrial and organizational psychology, maybe it's useful to people even so, right? Maybe when you put a team in a room and they all do their Myers-Briggs type indicator and they talk about communicating with one another, that's useful to them. And the question is whether that's true. So it may not surprise you that that is not true. Jung is obviously one of the great names in psychology from the 20th century. I think he's incredibly overrated myself, but he has some very dodgy views on race. He has some very superstitious views, but more than that, the way he developed his typology, on which Myers-Briggs is based, is something that the famous psychologist Adam Grant calls me search. And a more vulgar way of putting that is he pulled it out of his backside. So, of course, he was a therapist and he saw patients and he thought about the world and he read very deeply and he had a scholarly attitude to things. And this was the best that he could come up with in the 20s and 30s. He came up with his 4-part typology: extroversion, thinking, feeling, perceiving, and judging. And what's the one I'm missing? Intuitive and sensate. Those are his 4 things. He didn't, study millions and millions of people in a systematic way and distill human personality down to essays. But they did do that in the 1970s. And they came up with something called the Big Five, which is sometimes abbreviated as OCEAN. It's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. Now, if you're familiar with Myers-Briggs, and you'll notice that there's only one dimension that overlaps with Myers-Briggs, and that's extroversion. So science, even since the very early days of Myers-Briggs, professional psychologists used to clutch their pearls. This thing isn't valid, it's not reliable, I don't know why we're using it so much. But the Myers-Briggs company was bought by a company that has an incredible marketing apparatus. And I would be surprised to meet somebody that didn't know their Myers-Briggs type or had never done a Myers-Briggs test. Has anybody not ever done a Myers-Briggs type inventory in their career? All right, we're not getting answers in the chat. So 2 of the biggest predictors so you might say, okay, Myers-Briggs, it's not very, but it's useful to people. Well, you'd want Myers-Briggs to be able to predict something. You'd want it to predict an organizational outcome that we care about. What do we care about? We care about performance. We care about engagement. We care about team alignment. We care about relationships at work. We care about adapting work, having people doing work that's fit for their capabilities and personality. We care about those things, right? Those are the sort of outcomes. So the question is Myers-Briggs a good predictor? In other words, if you Myers-Briggs a whole bunch of people and you use that for a certain task, allocating them to teams, allocating them to roles, forming teams with them, does that work? And the answer is Myers-Briggs been around for, like, I want to say it's been around since the 40s. So that's almost 100 years. It's been studied a lot. And the people who have studied it said basically it doesn't predict very much, that it's not very useful for any of these things, despite the claims on the Myers-Briggs website. So the question for you is, and this is an interesting question, is how is this a billion-dollar industry? A multi-billion-dollar industry. Personality testing is maybe closer to a $50 billion industry. I have this statistic in one of my books. It's a massive industry. And is it built on rubbish? Now, when I told people that I was going to debunk the Myers-Briggs type indicator, and there's some really great stuff on the internet from a guy called Adam Grant on this. The question you have, when I told people I was going to do that, my social erupted saying Myers-Briggs was life-changing for me. I thought about the world completely differently. I thought about relationships completely differently. It gave me such a great insight into myself. So people love Myers-Briggs. Love it, love it, love it. I've never met anybody who says, I did Myers-Briggs and it sucked. So here's the problem. There's something called the Forer effect. And you may or may not find this fascinating, but I find this absolutely fascinating. So there was a professor in the 1940s who gave a personality questionnaire to his class, right? He's got like 30 students, they're all freshmen, whatever. Give him a personality questionnaire, and they fill it out assiduously. And then he takes the results and he calculates the results and he gives them back the results of this personality test. And he tricked them. Here's the problem. The professor was doing an experiment with psychology undergraduates, as most good psychology professors do. And he tricked them and he fed them back randomized feedback. So he took what they said and he shuffled the deck, if you will, and then he handed back them feedback and said, this is your personality test. They evaluated that as being 4.54 out of 5 is that this suits me. This has provided me with insights. That's an incredible thing. And that's the Forer effect, is when you tell people something about themselves, and this applies to astrology, and this applies to which Game of Thrones character are you, this applies to which Star Trek character are you, these BuzzFeed quizzes on the internet. When you feed back people something about themselves that sounds positive, like has anybody ever read a negative astrology prediction? Your life's going to turn to shit next week? No, they haven't, right? So that's called the Forer effect. And it's a really assiduous effect. And it affects why these things are so popular too, is because we like to be told nice things about ourselves. One of the other problems with the personality type indicator is if you think about two leaders that I'm very fond of talking about. Who has watched a television show called The Office, set in Dunder Mifflin in the United States? I can't remember what David Brent's company was called. It's a fabulous show, right? If you ask those guys, those leaders who are, let's say, because we're being super nice, they're questionable, narcissists probably is a better word for them. If you ask them what they thought of themselves as leaders on some sort of questionnaire, self-report questionnaire, they would say they're open-minded, they're collaborative, they build trust in the team, they're an inspirational leader, they're very good at working with people, all that kind of stuff. If you feed back a leader like David Brent, or I can't recall the guy's name in the United States, the one that's played by Michael Scott, you feed him back his own self-concept, are you serving him? Is this useful to him for his development? And the answer is, I don't think it is, right? If you tell these people on the questionnaire just feeds back to you what you already think about yourself. So is reinforcing their faulty self-concept a good thing? And that's another question with personality testing and so forth, is it feeds back to you your self-concept. And frequently when you're working in change with people, one of the things you want to do is you want to alter their self-concept, or you want to challenge their self-concept. You want to challenge the gap between their behavior and what they think their behavior is. And we all can think of politicians whose, would say their number one values are honesty, integrity, and thriftiness, who behave utterly different. So that's the Forer effect, and that's some of the problems with Myers-Briggs. And one of the ways that, and this is relevant not just to the world of change, but to the world more generally, is information comes to us from basically four different ways of parsing information. This is from a subject called epistemology, it's a sub-branch of philosophy. And one of the ways that you can evaluate something is with intuition, right? So someone presents you with new information. There's neuroscience, say it's on change, say something. Your intuition may nod at it, or it may challenge it. You can also use logic. Does this make up? Does it stack up? For example, one of the things logic helps you do is if people use metaphors. Politicians and business people are fond of using metaphors. So if someone refers to a burning platform as essential to change, that's a metaphor because nothing's alike, right? You have to think about what are the consequences of thinking about change in that way. And I would say, and there's a chapter in the book on this, that it's harmful. That burning platform isn't just, it's a metaphor, so you can't say, well, it's true or false because nothing's really burning. You can say, is it helpful? What are the consequences of it? Resistance to change is another metaphor. It's a metaphor from physics, or it's a metaphor from political science for groups of people who oppose authority. So resistance to change is another metaphor. You have to ask yourself, if you're using a metaphor of resistance to change, which is very commonplace in the change world, it's like, what are the consequences of thinking about people as resistant to change? And I have a whole chapter on resistance to change where I say it's a terrible idea and it's a bad way to think about change generally. So I won't go further into it. The other two dimensions of this are authority. So a lot of what we get in the world today, the information we get, the knowledge we get in the world, comes from someone else. And there are YouTube channels, and there are LinkedIn gurus, and there are TED talkers, and there are media superstars. and so forth. And these people are granted a certain amount of authority. So I would think like Simon Sinek would be one in the change world who people really love to listen to. Brene Brown would be another one. Malcolm Gladwell would be another one. And the question you have to ask yourself, if the knowledge is coming from authority, is where does my authority get their authority? Where does Malcolm Gladwell get his authority as a psychologist? Well, he's not a psychologist. Now, he's written 5 of the top 10 best-selling psychology books of all time. So mad props to the guy. He's an incredible writer, right? But psychologists read Malcolm Gladwell's stuff and they think, shake their head, because Malcolm Gladwell misrepresents a lot of psychology for the effect of telling a story. He wants to tell a good story, an engrossing story. That's his superpower as a writer. So you have to ask yourself, if the information comes from an authority, is do they have authority in this area? And this happens a lot in neuroscience. So you get a lot of neuroscientists now making proclamations about macro level phenomenon, like learning, change, motivation, love, trust, engagement. And they're neuroscientists. Now, what's a neuroscientist trained in doing? They're trained in studying the anatomy and physiology of the brain, the biology of the brain. And the macro level concepts, love, trust, engagement, passion, motivation, and all those kind of things, are pretty divorced from the biochemical and neurochemical processes within the brain. But yet you have neuroscientists making proclamations about organizational change. Are they qualified to do so? We need to ask ourselves the question. And then finally, there's research evidence. And what you frequently find is these 4 things will conflict. So your intuition may tell you something's true, an authority may tell you it's true, but when you double check the research, you find out that it may be less true or questionable or less reliable. And so this is a tool also living in the world we do today for combating something that is called information disorder. And it's something that began to be written about, really started to boom in 2016, where we had Brexit and we had an election in the United States. The word of the year in those days was post-truth, was the Oxford English Dictionary. Word of the year was post-truth. I don't know if you remember, as far back as 2016. And the fact is today that we're deluged with information. Some information scientists reckon that we read the equivalent of 174 newspapers a day. That's incredible, right? If you think about that. The information that assaults our senses from our inboxes and our Slack channels and our YouTube channels and our LinkedIn feeds and our email inboxes and whatever, 174 newspapers a day. And also what's happened, and this is another feature of information disorder, is the quality of information has gone down. So what's happened is that there used to be single authorities for news. So an example, in America, they used to have something called the CBS News. And there was this dude called Walter Cronkite, who's a very trustworthy looking white guy. And at the end of the news show, he used to say, and that's the way it is, December 7th, 1964, right? Then Walter Cronkite said that was true, right? There wasn't like, dude, it's fake news. Can't be right. I can't trust the mainstream media. Those days are very, very recent inventions. What's happened is information sources are democratized because of the internet. So anybody with a keyboard and a YouTube channel can put forth content, and if they're charismatic and persuasive in production of content, if they're good marketers and they're charismatic speakers, they can lift themselves as an authority. And as you lift yourself as an authority, you get more followers. If you get more followers, it appears your authority is greater. So you have this virtual cycle of people who are terrifically good at manufacturing themselves as experts, but who perhaps don't have the credentials or qualified thinking. And this is the world today. And so you guys may know this, but there was a guy who was convinced that there was a pedophile ring running a pizzeria in Washington, D.C. In the basement of a pizzeria, some of the politicians in the United States were pedophiles, and they had this thing. And you say this sounds ludicrous, right? But the guy took his AR-47 and drove to the pizzeria and started shooting the place up. How did he come to believe that there's a pedophile ring in a Washington pizzeria? And the answer was was living in something called a filter bubble. When you're in a filter bubble, everybody thinks the same way as you do. So as far as he was concerned, this was God's truth, right? These democratic operatives were corrupt. And so this is the world of information disorder. And the tool that I presented on the previous page is a critical thinking tool called Liar. Is one way when you read claims about nutrition or about parenting or about politics or about economics or something, you're always inundated with people making assertions about the world. You need a tool critical thinking I was advanced as one of the tools to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff. All right, we've gotten a long ways away from change. All of this found its way into a book. The book was supposed to be out today. It was supposed to be like drum roll, the book's out today. It won't be out till next week, but that is the new book. And on my operating table, you can see Dexter there, are a bunch of myths that when I began to think about them and studying them, researcher really shocked my system. One of them is the death and dying curve from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. One of them is MBTI, which we've talked about. One of them is resistance to change, we've talked about. One is neuroscience, we've talked about a little bit. One is burning platforms. So these are the chapters in the book. And I think it's going to be a fun read. And I will probably get rotten fruit thrown at me on LinkedIn for saying some of the things I say. I've also started another project, and this is maybe getting closer to the subject of this talk. We said at the beginning that, change needed to change, that organizations were so crazy different from 20 years ago, and that the human sciences had made so many advances in our understanding of human beings and how they change and what's important to them in their working lives and purpose and autonomy and all of those great things. And psychological safety is an important predictor of team performance. All these things we're learning, have they found their way into the change management world? Or is the change management world still stuck in the 1980s? I think it's still stuck in the 1980s. And I think a lot of the ideas from the 1980s weren't that great to begin with, and they're certainly not relevant to organizations in the third decade of the third millennium. And so these are some of the topics, and I'm going to skate through a few of them, but one of them is very near to my heart, is behavioral science. So I'm going to talk about that at a little bit of length. Another topic is diversity and inclusion in change. There's a lot written in the world about how people who are diversity and inclusion experts want to use change management to promote their policies and advance their ideas. This is the other way around, is are we thinking about change in a way that respects differences between people? We'll come to that in a minute. There's a lot on habit change in the world today that I think is interesting. There's interesting work today on mental health, trauma, and change. ChatGPT is being increasingly used to change communications. What are the effects on that of change management? Gamification and change is something that we're all familiar with, in neuroscience and change. So those are the sort of proposed chapters of the book. And this book's probably due out like in the autumn or something like that. It depends. I always say that. When I say it's going to be out in autumn 2023, autumn 2024 is a safe place to place your bet. So anyway, let's talk about a little bit about the future of change management. And one of the things that is prevalent in the world today is the information deficit model, which is that if I give people enough information, they'll behave differently. That's the basic assumption of the world. And it's an assumption that underlies a lot of our work in educating children, educating them in schools, a lot of our work in change management in organizations, a lot of our work in public policy and helping people to, for example, mask wearers and anti-vaxxers, right? If you provide someone who's anti-mask a scientific paper and say, hey, read that, masks work, right? Is that going to change their behavior? Not in a million years, right? If someone's adamantly opposed to climate science and you say, hey, look, there's this new study in Nature magazine that shows that anthropogenic global warming increased by, they don't care. So there's this kind of false notion, and it's a notion that also infects business too, is that what we're doing when we're communicating change is we're providing people with information. We're providing them with a business case, with a rationale, with the North Star. We're providing them with stuff that goes in their head, and that stuff that goes in their head will change their behaviors. Yeah, you can have a signed copy of my book. You have to send me your address, though, and I have to mail it to you. Who recognizes this? Leah recognizes this. Maud recognizes this. So this is a sort of an experiment at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. And if you look back in human history, millennia, in fact, if you look back 100,000 years in human history, women have been complaining about male accuracy. Like even back when we were living in caves, the Neanderthal dude was putting stuff all over the place, right? So this problem of male accuracy is one that Has been troubling fair sex for a long time. So they did this experiment at Schiphol Airport where they stuck a fly in the urinal. And this seems a ridiculous thing, right? There's a little plastic fly. You can buy them, by the way, on Amazon. You can go on Amazon, you can buy a box of plastic flies, and you stick them in urinals around your house, and people will think you're weird. So this improves male accuracy by 80%. Now, hang on a minute, right? This problem's been around for hundreds of thousands of years. How is sticking a piece of plastic in a urinal improving male accuracy? Like, if we want to understand human behavior, we want to understand these like really bizarre results. And this is a very bizarre result. Yeah, I know it's super gross down. I'm sorry, I apologize. So this experiment at Schiphol Airport improved male accuracy by 80%. This is an example from behavioral science. But let's take a model of human behavior that's prevalent in an organization, one that is the most incredible rubbish, but it's very commonplace. And I shudder when I see it in client RFPs and client proposals. Does ADKAR explain the fly? So did this hypothetical male become more aware? Did it change their desire? Did you give them new knowledge? Did they plan new actions? Was this a planful event? Oh, I'm going to be more accurate. Was there reinforcement? The answer is all this is false. So the question is, how did the behavior change then, right? This is a very commonplace model of behavior change for individuals and organizations. How did it change in the fly example? This is an example, I think, forgive me if you've heard this a million times or something like that, but what's your intuition tell you about these four numbers? People who have a heart attack, what % of them change their diet, exercise, and smoking behavior? There's a desire to hit the fly. That's right. Yeah. You guys have seen this before. Yeah, the answer is actually less than 10%, is 7%. So here's an interesting question. We were talking about the information deficit model, right? So you've got a dude, let's presume it's a dude, it's my age, right? They've had a heart attack. They've been carted off the hospital in an ambulance. They've stuck a catheter in, they've stuck a stent in his coronary arteries, and the doctor says, you're going to make it. But he says, hey, buddy, you're going to have to change. Exercise more, eat more vegetables, and cut out the smoking, whatever it is. 7% change their behavior. Now, you've provided them with facts, right? Fact is, bro, you're going to die, right? Your arteries were clogged and they're going to clog again. And unless you change your life, ain't going to make it very far, right? That's a fact, right? The second fact is that this is a very emotional experience. As they're lying there in a hospital bed, thinking that might be the last time, that might have been the last time I see my loved ones. It still might be the last time I see my loved ones. So you provided them with both facts and you provided them with intuition, with emotionally salient information, like you're going to die, bro. You won't see your wife and kids again or whatever, assuming again it's a male. So a heterosexual male, I should say, rather. So you're provided with facts and feelings and it still doesn't work. So the question is, for us as people who are experts in change, are experts in learning, are experts in transformation, is if facts and feelings don't change behavior, what does change behavior? So here's some stuff. And I call this black magic. And I apologize, this was a slide I used in an earlier talk, earlier, I think way back in the dark days of 2022. In the bottom right of this chart, you'll see an academic study. It's quite famous. It's on organ donation. And in blue are countries that have fairly high rates of organ donation. In other words, if you're in a motor accident or something like that, you give them permission to harvest your organs, right? Give them to some kid who needs a transplant. So those blue bars are in the region of 75, 80, 85%. And then there are the yellow bars in the other countries, and those are in the region of 15 to 30%, right? The biggest predictor of this difference between these two cohorts of countries is whether you ask them to opt in or opt out. If you ask people to opt out, you get very high rates of organ donation. If you ask them to opt in, like I go to get my driver's license, renewed, and I have to check a box saying harvest my organs, I'm less likely to do so. That is changing one word from opt in to opt out. And it's producing behavioral shifts of enormous magnitude. Now, if you think about how much effort we spend as management consultants trying to shift client behavior sometimes, or as parents trying to shift kid behavior, or as public policy people trying to shift society's behavior, whether it's mass or vaccination or whatever, climate behavior, sustainability, whatever it is. If you think about the effort we sometimes expend in getting people to change, this produces substantial change with change of a box. And that's why I call it black magic, because some of the stuff that happens in behavioral science, whether it be the fly or this study here, is like, wow. So here's another one on the bottom left. I used to get these letters. I used to be really annoyed by them. I have a massive personal computer, gaming computer here with massive graphic cards. I use a ton of electricity. I used to get this letter saying, this is your energy use, this is your eco-efficient neighbor, and this is your average neighbor. And I used to find this an annoyance. Do you know what that letter does? It reduces domestic energy consumption by 7%. Now, if you're like me, you think, holy shit, they sent me a letter. And so for the price of a postage stamp, for 36 cents or whatever it is in the United States, they produced a 7% reduction in domestic energy use. That's an incredible amount of change. I mean, if you think about if you're a marketing person, you increase sales or market share by 7%, I mean, you change consumer behavior by 7%, it's enormous. So we're dealing with a very big change with a very small intervention. Here on the top right is another piece of black magic research. It's when you ask people for money for charitable donations. If you use something called social proof, social norms, with various different names in behavioral science, you say tens of thousands of people like you have already contributed to blah, 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 blah. Now you think, like, who's dumb enough to fall for that, right? Who's stupid enough to fall for the fact, like, tens of thousands of people, get now while supplies last, right? Fall for it. People do fall for it. You double the level of contributions. Again, you've made a very, very tiny intervention, a very small change in the way that you phrase your request, and you almost double the level of contributions. And so this is a hallmark sometimes of behavioral science, is that you could produce very great effects from very small changes. Now, the question is people who specialize in helping organizations change is, how do you harvest some of this black magic for the work we do in digital transformation? How can you harvest this in areas like, let's take some examples. How do we align behaviors with our espoused values? So the IBM, how do we make sure that leadership behaviors are aligned with them? Do we give them behavioral support? What are our behavioral interventions? Well, there are people on Jesus's team in IBM Consulting thinking about how we do that. But that's one application. How do we get people to use learning content? You know, when I joined IBM like 18 months ago or something like that, and I stumbled upon learning and knowledge, I thought, holy moly, that is an incredible richness of content, you know, rivaling, and I've worked at major universities all the time, that puts them all to shame, the sort of content that an IBM consultant can access with a touch of a button. But how do you get them to use it? You can lead them to water, but how do you make them drink? The other question is, of course, people might attend these courses. So you might attend a course on learning and knowledge with the best of intentions of using it. But if you recall from earlier in this talk, only 10% of knowledge management education transfers to the job. That's a really dissatisfying number. It's a horrible number. So how do we enable people who formulate corporate strategy to recognize corporate biases in their team? How do we help people to adapt to new roles and transformational change? These are all, if you want to call, use cases for behavioral science. So I want to say, like, now I'm talking to a bunch of consultants, and they're going to say, okay, where are the case studies? You know, where are the examples? Where are the models? Where are the tools? Where are the proof points and all of that? Here's the exciting thing. They don't really exist. So behavioral science has been applied in public policy, in wellness, in sustainability, in inclusion, in a number of areas, but very rarely in learning and development, and very rarely in culture change, and very rarely in change management, and very rarely in leadership development. This is an undiscovered country. Now, that's good and bad, right? The bad thing is like, you gotta do your groundwork yourself, the spade work yourself. You can't just like go on the Lighthouse and say, download me a behavioral science toolkit and let me run along to my client at Honda or Toyota or British Petroleum with it. It's not that easy in organizational change because the use cases haven't been very well developed yet. But I think the behavioral science is really one of the most important areas in organizational change in the world. In fact, if somebody said, like, what's the most important thing in organizational change right now, is saying building behavioral science into the organizational change, the change management work we do for organizations. And as an alternative to ADKAR, here is a more comprehensive model, or many different formulations of it. I'm not going to launch into it, but capability, opportunity, and motivation, they each have dimensions and they're targeted towards a behavior. But one of the things that ADKAR and different kind of psychology-based formulas don't recognize is the fact that context matters, environment matters. So there's an experiment by a guy called Wansink that, in movie theaters, they serve you these troughs of popcorn, sort of gallons and gallons of popcorns if you go to an American movie theater. They use behavioral science, by the way, to get you to upgrade. Have you ever noticed if you order a medium popcorn, they say, do you want to make it a large for 20 cents? Like, who in their right mind would say no, right? That's behavioral science right there in action. Marketing people are very good with behavioral science. And so one of the ways to get people to eat less popcorn is they have different size containers. And that was the most effective intervention that they made to get people to reduce popcorn consumption. If you want to eat less, buy smaller dinner plates. Research shows that that's true, right? You don't have to read the Atkins diet book. You don't have to read books on keto and everything like that. If you want to eat less, buy smaller plates. It sounds so trivially easy, but the environment matters. And that's one of the things that old school pre-20th century models of human behavioral change didn't really recognize sufficiently. This is an insight from behavioral economics, is that the context matters terrifically because human beings are used to making fast and frugal decisions. And so rather than rationally thinking through option A, option B, pluses, minuses, risks, rewards, et cetera, it's not the way we do things. We're very sensitive. This fast and frugal reasoning makes decisions very, very quickly, and they're very highly contextually dependent. So I'm going to wrap up because I think we're going to be running out of road pretty soon. There's a suite of behavioral change tools. There are a lot of pictures like this one that are available. These can be adapted, I think. That work is still in progress. I want to talk about one more chapter that I think is a really interesting chapter from the upcoming book. I'm going to only spend about 3 minutes on it. My question is, for you, those of you who are change people, is does stakeholder mapping, which is one of the techniques we use to understand the diversity of people that our digital transformations will affect in an organization, is that a robust way of dividing stakeholders into groups so that we understand how to communicate, how to educate, how to engage with them in change? I'll leave that question. I'm not too sure either. Are personas generated, do they sufficiently take into account organizational diversity? And I worry about it. So I've solicited, I'm not going to write this book myself, by the way, I'm going to have contributed chapters, someone who's an expert on inclusion and change to think about questions like, is stakeholder analysis colorblind? Is that doing a good enough job? Because we know that changes in corporate policies affect non-white, non-male, cis, non-LGBTQ, if you want, differentially. For example, remote working, find out that people, non-white people and women are very much more in favor of it than are traditional men. So that's an interesting data point. And if things like this are true, if the policies we have in an organization are differentially affecting scales, are we sufficiently thinking about these categorizing by job role or by function? Are we doing a good enough job? Our persona creations, do they take diversity sufficiently into account? They produce an average, which is one of my worries about them. And there's an old saying that if you can't swim, walking across a river that's an average of 4 feet deep is a very risky endeavor. So averages are useful. They're useful shortcuts, but they also conceal a lot of complexity, a lot of degrees of freedom, and a lot of diversity. And so this is going to be the gist of the chapter on inclusion and change management that is in the works as we speak. And the question is, and I think this isn't a question, this isn't a leading question, this isn't a rhetorical question, but is there implicit bias in our change methods? And this is really, really a question I don't know, but I would love to know. I would love to know, and if there were, I would love a formula for being able to get rid of that. And so this new book, anyway, that I'm struggling with now, I'm recruiting content from around the world, or people from Australia and people from Europe and people from Asia contributing chapters to the book. But these are some of the topics. Mental health, I think, is something that's become more important, at least if you look at the social fora. It's becoming a bigger and bigger deal. Inclusion and change, gamification, chatgpt. You've heard all the subjects. So those are the chapters that are being written as we speak. I'm pretty excited about this book, actually. So you can give me feedback whether you think it sounds like a good idea or not. If you're an author, you have to delude yourself that what you're doing is the most important thing in the world. This is the thing that we're going to change the world, and you're not always right. But that can sometimes be sufficient motivation to get you working on those cold winter mornings in Colorado. This delusional narcissism that you're going to write a book that's going to change the world. Anyway, this might be it. Anyway, the future of change management. And some of the big questions then that we talked about are, as organizational change up the human sciences? I think plainly not. It's based on theories from mid 20th century, late 20th century. I think there's a lot of the orthodoxy in change management says that change always has to be hard. People have to be resistant. They're like mules. There's even some BS in neuroscience, which is a change pains the brain. It stimulates the same pathways. Is complete rubbish. But it's by a guy who's very famous in neuroscience, a guy called David Rock, right? Huge name in the field. This particular assertion of his is rubbish, that brains hate change. It's a dim view of human adaptability, and it's also a self-fulfilling prophecy. So this is one of those things. I showed you that liar model. It's like somebody who's an authority. You have to say, where does my authority get their authority? And sometimes you have to get into the weeds and you have to read the thing. I know this guy's having authorities, your go-to people, is a really useful shortcut in the world, because we don't have time to do the 45-minute research to fact check that we saw on YouTube. So we have go-to authorities, right? Question is, we have to be very careful about who we select as an authority. So these are some of the questions. What's evidence? Cognitive biases, disrationality, information disorder. You've heard some of the topics here. I won't bore you with those any further. And so that's it. That's much longer. That's like at least full 15 minutes longer than I thought it would be, but I love the sound of my own voice, unfortunately, so I apologize if we've run over time. Those are my email addresses. That's my YouTube page. You can hit me up on LinkedIn. What are my views on, is that natural language processing, Juliana, or neuro-linguistic programming? Anyway, fire away with questions. ChatGPT is interested in you. Who's got a question? Who's got a discussion point?
Hi, Paul. It looks like we have a question from K. Elmore. So K. Elmore, I'm going. All right, they disappeared. All right, Paul. It looks like we don't have any questions in the chat or anyone here who has their hands raised. Any last words before we close the session?
Yeah, Kareem has just asked a question. He's just asked a question. He hasn't asked a question yet.
All right.
It's good.
All right, there it is.
Yeah, Natasha, I'm still working on that, really, as well. So I haven't got a well-formed view on it. I'm just like super curious because it's already being used in some organizations. There's now been a release this morning. Just this morning, I read about a ChatGPT 4, which can do more than text. It can do images. It can create stories. So I don't know. It's an undiscovered country. But you bet your boots by 2030 that a lot of the work that change people are doing, perhaps in communications, that's going to be done by bots. You can be pretty sure of that. So we have to think about the implications of that as practitioners. Yes, Julie Soriano. Yeah, there's a behavioral science community of practice, meets every second Tuesday. The next Tuesday it's going to meet is coming up. 4 days from now, 6 days from now, whatever that is. Would you send me an email or send it to Natasha, one or the other? Send it to me. Send me an email. I'll put you on the mailing list. And we have external speakers come in from behavioral scientists from around the world come in and talk to us about good stuff. No problem, Julie. Anybody else? Kareem, did you ask a question, Kareem? I agreed with your premises, but I didn't see a question. All right. All right. That was a comment. Kareem, I couldn't agree with you more. Get in touch. Stay in touch. Stay in touch or get in touch. One of the others. Anyone else? Gus, thank you very much. Thank you, Leah. She's awesome. I'll speak to you in a little bit. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, John, for setting this up and facilitating it. Really, really very much appreciated your work in getting this to work. Thanks, Maud. And everyone, okay. Have a beautiful day, everybody. Take it easy. Bye-bye.